Hi, my name's Cathy Millett, and this week we're looking at how I built some dioramas to demonstrate water on the Great Model Railway Challenge, which is a UK TV show. So I've just finished filming today, one heat of the Great Model Railway Challenge, driven back home, and I've got 3 days before I need to be back on set, and they want me to pull together a diorama to show how I do water. So this is actually my Patreon only edition. So it's twice as long as everything else, so you'll get twice as much time of me talking. But first up, this is the stream I plan to model. Very important to pick a stream and real life. It's very hard to model your imagination and make it look real. And I originally set all this up to do a step-by-step on the programme. They weren't sure what they wanted, so they said to me, oh, could you bring a demonstration on how to do water? Because you're supposed to be good at water, Cathy. So I said, oh yeah, very, very happy to do that. So I created 6 identical dioramas. 2 of them just the pane board, just hollowed out a bit. 2 of them to a halfway stage with no water, and 2 of them completely done to a certain stage with resin. I actually did have to go back at the end and pour another layer of resin because I just ran out of time to get 2 pours in, and resin always needs a second pour. So that's why there's 6 of everything. And I started off with just normal blue craft foam. It's a very typical foam that you use for anything like this. It's nice and dense. You can actually sand it, as I do in a minute. And I wanted to make sure they were identical so I could almost show that step by step very easily. So the first thing I did was draw a template and transfer it to each of the 6 dioramas. Then I used my Foam Factory hot wire tool, which is really useful on this type of thing, to carve it out. The only thing is I don't find it's very even in its carving, and it sometimes does undercuts and it's not very smooth. Now the good news is this kind of foam can be sanded. So just normal sandpaper, quite a rough one, will take it off. If you're not careful, you can kind of almost tear the foam, so just be slightly gentle. If you haven't got a hot wire, you can use a knife. It's just harder to get some of these shapes and it'll blunt quite quickly, so make sure you sharpen it or change blades regularly. Now I'm actually thinking, what am I going to do with all these whilst I'm watching this? And I've got 2 that are going to be water and one's going to stay as is, just as a diorama. I might put robots on some of them. I'm going to do at least 2 of them as snow and ice of some description when I get onto that section, which will hopefully be next year, because I'd love to do some snow and ice dioramas. And this, all the vegetation's done there, so I should be able to get some really great hoarfrost and maybe ice in there as well. So I'm glad they haven't got any resin on them, because I can then do the resin right from scratch. I love the way that I keep this big pile of foam, because it might be so useful one day. I'm such a modeller. So having carved all that out and smoothed it to some extent, I needed to dam it. And I've had some very bad leakages over my life. So now I probably go over the top, and I use silicone glue, and this is overhead projector acetate, and I use them to make dams to keep that resin in, because otherwise the resin will flow straight out the ends. It's just like water when you put it on. And I do it at this point so that I have a nice smooth finish. I've done it after the scenery before now, and all the bits sticking out stop you getting a decent seal. Talking of sealing your foam is quite important. It will react to some things. So I just used here a brown raw umber acrylic, artist acrylic paint. And you can see I've got a huge pot. And I put quite a thick coat on, just glad to get it all covered. It also helps if anything shows through any of your later layers of scenery, all you'll see is brown. And I will eventually paint the edges black. I just haven't done that at this point. I'll do it after I've taken the dam off, otherwise I'll probably tear that paint colour off the foam. Now it can be a bit like watching paint dry, watching me do these 4 dioramas, but in this instance, because all the layers are actually wet, as in they're all acrylic water, I can just carry on to each layer without too much worry about whether the previous one has dried. So I'm now putting on layers of glue, especially on that vertical upright. And I want to do that so the grout that I'm going to use will stick to it. I actually wasn't that happy with this grout. It's the first time I'd particularly used it, or it's actually the second time. And both times I've had problems, and it's because it's not sanded. So in future, I would mix this half and half with a plain, fine, sharp sand, because that lets the water flow a lot better. And what I found now was it took a lot of water to get through that grout. So I ended up flooding it. And that's partly why it's up on paint pots. So when it drips onto a newspaper rather than gluing those dioramas to the base, which is always a problem if you let them just sit down. And to me, I make great shape paint pots that are perfect for this. In fact, the other day I went and bought 4 more X1 pots of gloss black for a project, and then realised I found them and they were all under a diorama holding it up when it was drying. There we go. So I've used my normal isopropyl alcohol and water mix. That's a third isopropyl alcohol and 2/3 water, and then a third white glue and 2/3 water. This actually looks a bit thinner than that. It doesn't matter because the tar grout does stick fairly well and you put quite a lot of layers of glue on over the time. Next up, I hair dried it so I could get on a bit quicker, and that's probably mostly off camera. And I used a diluted black, just artist's acrylic again, wash to darken those areas where the water's going to sit. Water darkens the soil around it. It makes it look darker when it's damp. So you want to make sure your streams look slightly darker at those bases. Hair drying again, because I still only had 3 days to do this, and my big worry was, would my resin set? My resin could take 2 to 4 days to go off, and I didn't mind it being slightly tacky when I took it there, but I didn't want it to be still liquid in case they picked it up and looked at it and the whole thing ran. So, more hair drying. Next up though, Woodland Scenics Talus. I actually started with a bit of sand though, a pinch of sand, and then I used Woodland Scenics Talus on top. And I love Woodland Scenics Talus for all of these kind of stream beds. It's got various different sizes. You can put the thick ones on first and then the smaller ones around it to fill the gaps. And I used a couple of the finer scales on this, and then just used my isopropyl alcohol and water mix and that white glue and water mix again to glue it. I got a bit carried away, so I did end up having to mop up some of that excess white glue with kitchen paper, and that's fine. You will often put too much on, and in some ways it's better to have too much glue on there than too little. But again, it's going to be very liquid at this point, so it is worth hair drying it. Just be careful with the talus because it will fly everywhere if there isn't enough glue on it. It's a good test of seeing whether you've actually glued it well enough. Now you can see it's getting darker outside, so this is still on the first day trying to get every single thing done. And the most important thing to me was I had to pour the resin because I was going to have to leave it for 24 hours. So now I thought, oh, it looks too bright. So I put on a coat of sort of black and sort of raw umber, a wash really, just to darken all those stones down. They were just too bright. And I deliberately used the Woodland Scenics pale natural talus because you can colour it so easily to whatever colour you do want, and it hasn't got any colour in there. And when I look at the pictures, the pebbles are all quite pale, so I think it works fine. Now I checked the photos again around this point and decided that I could have put more variety into my pebbles. I could have perhaps coloured them a little bit. I didn't really have time, but I did add some green in because there's quite a lot of green in the pebbles. It's almost disappeared by the end, which is a bit of a disappointment. I might go back and add a bit more. But I just used some Vallejo, various different greens to add some extra mossy elements. Overnight, I spray painted some tubes. These are just black straws, and I painted them black, partly because it's easy to do, nice rattle can spray coat, and I left them to dry. I wanted to put something on with some moving water just to demonstrate it. So I took these straws and I added little strips of clear acetate, glued in one end into the pipe, and then pushed down and glued with super glue onto the other end into the stream. And that was just to put some movement in. I glued all the pipes in with super glue and zapped it so it's set straight away. It's really useful to have a zapper when you're using super glue, and when you're gluing a plasticky pipe, you know, spray painted plastic pipe down, the only thing that will stick it is probably super glue. The only problem you have occasionally is that if you flex these pipes, they're only straws, they're easy to flex, then the paint might crack off. So you just need to be careful not to allow them to flex too much when you're doing this kind of thing. And I did have a few problems with these, you know, little acetate bits springing off, which wasn't much fun. I also had a couple of shiny patches with my super glue, and they're easily covered up with just a little bit more grout, more isopropyl alcohol and water, and some more white glue. When all that was done, it was on to resin time. So I measured out my 1/3, 2/3, just using water actually, and a shot glass so that I had 1/3 and 2/3. Dry out those cups really well after you've marked the level, and then you can mix that up. Now I'm using magic water for my resin. It's my favourite water resin. It takes ages to dry, but it does set really nicely. It doesn't bubble much, and I've got to say, It's slightly rubbery, so it doesn't crack. It's easy to slice still if you need to cut the meniscus off the edges. Normally, I would leave these on the side and I would not touch them until they're entirely set. Unfortunately, I didn't have time for that, so I just got on with putting on all of these jute string roots and branches that I'd made. Now, I'd got some lovely jute string I'd bought for my Halo diorama, and I used them basically by untwisting jute string and then retwisting it into little sections and branchy bits. It took me a whole evening in front of the TV doing all of these, and it was great fun, but quite time consuming. And that's the one thing that the Great Model Railway Challenge doesn't allow you, is time. So, you know, you could never get this done in 24 hours on TV, but when you're sitting at home, it's actually quite easy to do quite a good diorama in just a couple of days because you have more time to allow things to dry. So I also put on some ground foam from Woodland Scenics. I mean, it goes on everything, it's brilliant. In this case, it was simulating moss. I glued it with a little bit of isopropyl alcohol and water and white glue mixes, and I just went back to adding more and more of those roots. The finer ones I kept to the end and added, the bigger ones went on first. I did them on both sides just so that it looked cohesive. And basically, there's an awful lot of this footage now, as I just glue in place root after root after root. But isn't that what we love about modelling? The fact it takes time and it absorbs us. And this is really absorbing. The only trouble is when I'm videoing, I can't put music on and I can't put any videos on or anything in the background, just in case I need to use the audio that I've recorded. In this instance, I decided that I needed to speed it all up, so I couldn't use that audio particularly well. So I've just re-recorded over the top. But normally I just sit there for ages. Now at this point, I had loads of branches, roots, whatever, and no leaves. And I hadn't got time to order it, even from Amazon. I could have if I'd got my act together, perhaps on the Saturday, but I hadn't. So I went and raided what I had in my cupboard. And that's the good thing about being a modeller for a long time, is you buy a lot of stuff. And I'd got these miniature plain and maple summer foliage, which are on these very stiff mats. And when I did my leaf, varieties of leaf, sort of discussing them video a while ago on YouTube, I kind of said, well, you can buy these, but I don't know how on earth you'd use them. And this was actually about 2 weeks later when I used these, and I thought, I found how I'm going to use them, but it's too late now because I put that out on YouTube. They come out in really stiff, sort of stretchy but straight lines because they're on a kind of mesh that's very, very straight, threads running through it. So you can just pull them off and they make natural branches with leaves on. It was really good, and I hadn't got time to go and really stick every leaf on hand one at a time. I did, however, pick up every single leaf that flew off these, and trust me, a lot of them flew off, and then glue those on with individual spots of glue. Yes, I'm that sad and anal, but it meant I could stick them onto those other jute strings and put some leaves on those, which just helped tie everything together. So all in all, I was really pleased, but I wish more leaves hadn't fallen off because it did take me quite a lot of time. And about this time I was thinking, I'm actually just blocking my effluent pipe. And I'd wanted to put some grey resin running down that effluent pipe. Looking at it, I did do it and it disappeared. And this is the trouble. I waited quite a long time after pouring the resin before doing this grey, but it just goes in and it runs and it merges into the rest of the resin. You have to wait until it's almost treacle consistency and it's not going to run out and join with the rest of the resin. And it's a little bit tricky, you know, getting that timing right. If it doesn't work for you using resin, then I would just say add a little bit of paint to gloss medium rather than trying to do it with the resin, because sometimes that resin is actually quite hard to get timing wise because it sets to the perfect consistency overnight. And maybe it's because I live in quite a cooler country, but I find it takes longer than the 24 hours to set. So I've set a second layer on these to go while I'm editing them up of resin, because I never did do that second coat of resin, which I knew they needed. And I put it to go, I'm editing this, and I know that it's going to be the perfect day to do that extra effluent at about midnight tonight when I'm nicely tucked up in bed. So we'll see. It will all look perfect by the time they're in the final result, but sometimes it does take you a couple of attempts to get everything in and looking good. So I'm still sticking individual leaves on. This is better than watching paint dry though, isn't it? I have to say, I really enjoyed this. I was not expecting to do modelling when I came home this weekend, but because I had a deadline and because somebody had asked me to bring in something, and I thought I haven't really got anything I can bring, in the end I lumped in all of my water dioramas and put them in the back of the car. The director came out and looked at them and picked the 4 he liked best, and we actually talked about those. So this whole step-by-step thing never happened on screen. And I haven't seen the episode yet that's out. It will be out after I put this up on YouTube. But the exec producer tells me that my diorama did make the final cut. So let's hope that you actually do get to see one of these on terrestrial TV, and apologise to anybody in a country other than the UK who isn't able to see this and is now getting very frustrated that I'm talking about a TV programme that they can't see. Hopefully eventually it will come to you and you will be able to see what I'm talking about. But don't worry, it will be literally a 2 or 3 second glance at one of these water dioramas. And I think it's actually about week 4 or heat 4 that the water dioramas come up. So at this point, I put on some, the resin's set enough now, I actually put on some acrylic gloss medium, which is really good because those acetate strips are just too thin. They don't look like water because they just look like a strip of acetate strip. I also decided that the resin had spread a bit far. It wicks really easily, unfortunately, and I didn't like it. So I put some matte varnish on, which is a good way of just knocking back the shine a bit of it. And then, even though it's a different medium, I used some enamel wash. I used that, I did put a bit on the beach area, but I mostly used it on the branches and those twiggy areas just to make them look a little bit depth between the fronts and the ends. So there was a little bit of variety in the shapes and colours of those branches. Yeah, I should have probably done it before I put all the leaves on and put all the resin in and did all the everything else, but you know, you look at these things afterwards, and that's the important thing. I was looking, when we're in between each of these camera takes, I was looking at the photos that I've got blown up in A3 size to see what they look like. And I think if I was doing it again, I'd put a couple of bricks into that resin because I saw 1 or 2 in there and they looked really good. And now, after all of that, this is the final result. I'm actually really pleased how they came out. They did get an extra layer of resin, which I couldn't have got done in 3 days because of the setting time. But I'm really pleased. And I've still got 2 resin-free dioramas to do that snow and ice with. So looking forward to that too. But this wouldn't be a Patreon video without a little bit of extra critique. So what would I have done differently? One of these dioramas has a little hump in the middle, so the water seems to flow both ways. Not exactly ideal. And looking at the close-ups on the photos, I would have spent more time rusting up that pipe and putting some rusty streaks on, some pigments, and just making it stand out a little bit more. I would have added more different colours to the pebbles and perhaps painted the ones that were in the stream a slightly darker colour, which seems to be what happens in the photo. And I might have thrown in the odd brick or some other exciting debris and put in a couple of other different types of vegetation just to make it all look a little bit more interesting. But hey ho, it was 2.5, 3 days to build, and that's with loads of setting time for the resin. So I'm pretty pleased with how it came out in the time.